From Exile to Rebellion. Welcome, class. Today we will be talking about the story of ancient Israel as we move from the period of the Babylonian exile to that of the Maccabean rebellion. So, when we left off, the Jewish religion had grown strong and unified under Isaiah and Ezekiel, prophets. Now, the Babylonian Empire had grown weak and disjointed under King Nabonidus, who created a conflict between the country's monarchy and high priesthood. Now, as all great empires do, ancient Babylon came to a screeching halt, a terrific fall, and that fall was brought about around 539 BC, when Babylon is invaded by the Achaemenid Persian Empire. This empire, headed by the Emperor Cyrus the Great, conquers all of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, a vast empire that once occupied modern-day Iraq, is invaded from the east, from what is now Iran, by the mighty Persian Empire. Now, Cyrus the Great, like later Persian rulers, had a remarkable tolerance for the diversity of religions he found within his empire. In a show of goodwill and tolerance, Cyrus permitted the Jews to return to Judah, their homeland, and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, as well as the city itself. Thus begins what's called the Restoration. So in this period, we see a arrival of new prophets, and biblically we refer to these as the post-exilic prophets, because they came to power in the period, came to influence in the years after the conclusion of the Babylonian exile. They included Haggai and Zechariah, who preached beginning in 520 BC, and encouraged pure sacrifices and the rebuilding of the temple against the wishes of the Samaritans. Now, before we continue, I need to have a word on who the Samaritans are, because by the time you get to Jesus' time, when they speak of the Good Samaritan and the Jewish-Samaritan conflict, there is some question as to who are these people. And some people confuse Samaritans with Sumerians, which are an entirely different set of people. Sumerians were the original Mesopotamian culture that founded the cities of Ur, Uruk, and Ubaid. That is not to be confused with the Samaritans of the Good Samaritan variety. They are referred to for the capital of Samaria, which was originally the capital of northern Israel during the divided monarchy period. Now, there are several individuals of possibly Israelite descent, possibly Edomite descent. There's possibly descent from other peoples. The debate rages on, but these people lived in the shadow of the ruins of Samaria, and they came to practice they still worship the same God, but often with elements of idolatry or with other cultural elements that their more orthodox Jewish counterparts considered to be unclean and improper. And this became the source of a great rivalry between the Samaritans, who regarded themselves as the descendants of the northern Israelites, and the Jews, who refused to acknowledge the Samaritans' possible Israeli origin, and instead considered them to somehow be some sort of deceitful pretenders. Malachi would preach later on, around 455 BC, and his criticisms concerned a lack of zeal in the people. The people were not really as enthusiastic about the worship of God and obedience to the law as they should be. Ezra came much later. Now, Ezra came in 398 BC to enforce the law of Moses, and Ezra was also a close friend and confidant of the Persian king, the Persian emperor. And as a result of this, he was actually afforded a great deal of freedom and power over Judah. Nehemiah was a contemporary of Ezra who focused less on the temple and more on the rebuilding of the walls of the city, which was a necessary repair to putting Jerusalem back to order. Additionally, the Jews, when they first arrived, had to remove all traces of their Babylonian stay, including any foreign wives. So that was a major event culturally, was the fact that many men had to dismiss their foreign-born wives. So Yehud. Now, the title Yehud is what the Persians came to call the satrapy that corresponds with the pre-exilic kingdom of Judah. So what back then was Judah, the Persians called Yehud. And Yehud was headed by David's descendant, Zerubbabel, who ultimately served as the satrap or governor of the region. And Jerusalem, the original national capital, remained the center of the satrap's government. All of this was in accordance with typical Achaemenid Persian policy. However, the populace still remained poor, especially in the peasants surrounding Jerusalem, and relatively small. The Jewish people were a minority at this point, even within their own homeland. So, the next issue we come to is this issue of the Messiah. Now, Zerubbabel ruled over the people, but was never anointed king. So despite being a descendant of King David, he was never formally blessed with the oils and named a king. And this was not necessarily just because Yehud was a Persian satrapy. The Achaemenid Persian rulers often had a number of lesser kings and princes who swore allegiance to the Persian emperor. So there was no reason why, or king or emperor. The point is, the Persian king, the Persian emperor, the man in charge of the Persian Empire, had lesser kings who served him. And because of this, it would not have been any major offense to the Persian royal family if Zerubbabel had been named king of Judah. However, that never occurred, nor were any of his children or grandchildren ever anointed. And it's around this time that people begin to speak of a belief in that the next Davidic ascendant to be anointed would not just be any Davidic descendant, but would be the Savior of Israel. The people who would, this person who would give the Jewish people a new homeland, a new independence, and would save them from this terrible lot that they were in. And the word Messiah, meaning anointed one, became the term for this Savior, since this person would be anointed and would not just be another ruler of the people, in the way that Zerubbabel and the other Davidic descended satraps were. And this is the origin of the word Messiah, which is the title that we would eventually come to use for Jesus. Now, the Greek word for anointed one is Christos, which, as you can see, is spelled down there. Chi, Rho, Iota, Sigma, Tau, Omicron, Sigma. And this is where we get the word Christ from. The word Christos. So, first of all, before we continue further, we got to take a look at the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Now, the Persian Empire is a truly massive entity. At its height, it stretched from what we would now consider parts of Greece and Macedonia, all in the west, and as well as parts of Egypt and Libya in the west, all the way to the borders of what we would now consider Iran, Afghanistan, and parts of India or Pakistan today. Now, let's talk about this empire. So, they lasted from 538 BC until 331 BC. And the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire was Cyrus the Great. Now, the Achaemenid Persians had two capitals: a more religious capital and a more secular political capital. And these were at Persepolis and Susa. The Achaemenids divided their empire into 36 satrapi, or provinces, and each satrapy was ruled by a governor known as a satrap. Now, the Achaemenid Persians themselves worshipped a religion known as Zoroastrianism, which was a religion that held that all of the universe was divided between a struggle between a good and evil deity, with other lesser deities joining in on one side or another in the conflict. However, despite this, they allowed all subject peoples to worship as they pleased. This was a major innovation for the Achaemenid Persians. So the Jewish people, along with other religions under Persian rule, were permitted a great deal of religious liberty by their Persian overlords, so long as they remained loyal subjects of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Now, the other major innovation that the Persians accomplished was that rebellions were punished by executing only the immediate conspirators, not punishing the entire peoples or city, peoples, the people as in like the plural, in the group of people, or the cities or countrysides, regions responsible for the rebellions. This is different than the way that the Assyrians or Babylonians handled the situation, where entire peoples and entire cities could be punished for the rebellion of a few individuals. So, despite Persian greatness and the fact that the Jewish people enjoyed a relatively decent condition under the rule of the Achaemenid Persians, all of this comes to a screeching halt with the rise of a young Macedonian prince known as Alexander the Great. But first, we got to talk about Greece getting involved. So, the border of the Persian Empire, there's a series of Greek city-states that were established on what we would now consider the easternmost coast of the Mediterranean Sea. If we're going back to our map we had earlier, city-states right in here, along the border of what we would now call Turkey. Now, the problem is these Ionian states existed here, and as Persia expanded ever westward, remember, Persia begins in what we would now consider Iran and gradually expands westward. So eventually the Persian Empire starts bumping up against the territory of these Ionian Greek states. And it begins to, and bit by bit, the Persian Empire begins to make a conquest of Ionia. Now, Athens viewed itself as the defender of the Ionic Greek states. And so Athens begins to aid these states and begins to find itself entering into war with the much larger Achaemenid Persian Empire. And this would lead to a war between the Greek states that were united in what became known as the Delian League against the more powerful Persian Empire. In fact, they barely survived the Persian onslaught at the battles of Thermopylae and Marathon. Thermopylae is the battle you're probably most familiar with. It is the one that is epitomized in the terribly inaccurate movie 300, in which we hear the story of 300 Spartan warriors who held the pass at Thermopylae against a much larger force of Persian soldiers. The greater victory, of course, belonged to the Battle of Marathon. Marathon was a battle fought in a swamp several miles south of Athens. And this battle would become one of the most climactic in the history of the ancient world.